Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Winter's Monadrisha. This is AI, A World Without Work. Today, we have the pleasure of learning with Rabbi John Ziring and with Dr. Lisa Simon as part of this three-part series. As people come into the room, I'm going to resend the source sheets that went out by email and hand things over to Dr. Kelson.
Okay, thanks so much, Kayla. Welcome everybody to this year's Winter's Mon seminar. Today is Sunday, which is the day after Shabbat, of course. And on Shabbat, we have the opportunity to do two things related to work. On the one hand, we have the opportunity to rest from work, to focus on things besides what we do during the week. And on the other hand, we also have the opportunity, whether during Shabbat or as we ease back into the work week on Saturday night, to re-engage with the world of Maaseh, the world of work, and perhaps to reflect upon what our work is during the week, whether we met vocationally, formally, or otherwise, professionally or otherwise. What is it that we're doing in the world during the week in the world of action, in the world of Maaseh, and to perhaps redirect, revivify, and generally reflect upon that element of human existence, of human engagement. This seminar is, in a sense, this 3-day seminar is, in a sense, a parallel opportunity or analogous opportunity to reflect upon a momentously important part of human life, as I say, Jewish life and human life, indeed, which is work, creativity, labor, our engagement with the physical world, and beyond. And particularly, I'm excited this morning to speak about or introduce a seminar. Our speakers who are going to be speaking about the intersection of work, in the broadest sense, and artificial intelligence. And I won't define those terms in this moment. I'll leave that to our presenters. But I think it's fair to say that, at least for those of us who have not been in the back end and in the weeds of the development of artificial intelligence these past years, it's sort of hit us upon the world the past 6 to 12 months as a kind of revolution, if not an evolution. Taking the world by storm, and the possibilities and the questions that the burgeoning revolution of AI presents us are enormous. We've been addressing some of these broader issues throughout the year, Drisha. Some of the broader questions that this world of artificial intelligence might present us on a moral, Jewish, religious level. Questions such as the very definitions and natures of intelligence, of personhood, of agency, questions about the construction of technology. Should we have limitations on that construction? The notion of creating something which might perhaps outdo its creators. A host of questions which we and others are been grappling with. This 3-day seminar is focused specifically on one element of the questions that AI presents us with, which are the intersection of AI and human work and human labor and work, both today and tomorrow, much as we can anticipate. So I'm quite excited to hand things over to our presenters. This morning we have 2 presenters. Let me just put their full bios in the chat. Rabbi Jonathan Ziring and Dr. Lisa Simon. I'm going to have to just do one at a time. But they are substantial. There we go. Substantial bios. So their full bios are now in the chat. But I'll just know very Jonathan Ziring is my colleague, Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Migdal HaTorah, right? Recently appointed Rosh Yeshiva, I believe. So congratulations to you. And quite an established educator and scholar, and has been working on the questions that we're dealing with today. And Dr. Lisa Simon, who's the chief economist at Revelio Labs, which is a leader in the field of labor data analytics, domestically, globally, at large. And this is the questions we're dealing with today are part of her expertise. So we're grateful to you both for being with us and for guiding our investigation this morning. There will be opportunity at the end of our time this morning to ask questions and to be in conversation. So to the extent possible, as questions emerge, jot them down, and unless the presenter specifically asks for questions at a given moment, let's save them for the end of our time this morning, and we'll raise them then. So I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Ziring in just a moment. I'll just invite everybody who has their camera off that if you are in a situation where you're able to engage more visually and fully, it's always welcome and helpful to see with whom we're speaking. Okay, so thank you very much for being with us, and Rabbi Ziring, the podium is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Kelson. I'm very excited to be here with everyone. I just finished the Drisha fall session where we explored the impact of artificial intelligence on education and on halachic decision making. And over the next 2 days, we're going to be addressing the question of how AI can impact work and employment in the broadest sense, and what that means. Now, I should say at the outset that every time a new technology has emerged, one that makes tasks that we already have, that we already perform, easier, the fear that this would replace human beings fundamentally and make humans obsolete has been raised, and we'll see that over the next few days. But this was true when this has been true going back hundreds of years. There's a celebrated essay that we'll see, I think, tomorrow or in 2 days by John Maynard Keynes, where he was predicting this in the 30s, and obviously that hasn't happened. People are still working, and for every technology that was introduced that people thought would eliminate work, it often just transformed the type of work we do. In many cases, increased work in the process of that transformation. But nevertheless, I think we have to wonder about the possibility of what happens if it's actually right. What happens if one day we actually come up with a technology that is going to make the necessity for employment either non-existent, or at least minimize it to a significant extent. And there are at least many I don't know if I want to call them optimists or pessimists, but let's say techno-maximalists, who believe that AI is the technology that is finally going to bring us to that point. And this is true both in more technical writing, it's true in more popular writing. Popular writers like Yuval Noah Harari predict things like this in 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and again in Nexus, and in more technical writings, you'll find this as well. The goal for the next 3 days is as follows. Again, as I said, we don't know what the future holds, but my approach to thinking about these issues was very much influenced by an excellent book that came out of Oxford University Press called Future Morality. And in the introduction, the editor asks, why is it that it's important to publish a work of ethics on technologies that are emerging or may not yet have emerged, especially as we don't know the direction that they're going to take. And he says there's at least 2 reasons to engage in this type of thought experiment. One is, if you wait for the technology to actually develop, you may not practically have time to come up with a cogent response. And if you think that ethics, or for my purposes, Torah, has something to say to every situation that human beings can face, so then you need to start thinking about things before they exist, and definitely at their infancy, so that when the questions actually present you with their full immediacy, you have some response. That's one. And the second is that if you wait for a technology to develop, or for a particular problem that is raised by that technology to come into existence, the most that ethics or Torah can do is to respond. But if you think that the development of technology also carries with it value questions, so then you have no choice but to think about the questions before they happen, because you're not just asking how to respond to the technology, you're asking what technology should we even try to develop. And obviously, that question has to be asked before the technology has been created or while it is being developed. And therefore, even though we don't know exactly the directions that that the technology will take, as Lisa will talk about, we don't know. We can have certain predictions about which fields and which jobs will be most impacted, which are most exposed. We can't be sure. There can always be a radical shift tomorrow that we didn't anticipate. We still have to engage in the at least in the thought experiment before it happens, so that if there are ethical questions that guide how this technology should develop, we at least have the opportunity to offer the perspective, and we're just ready when the questions come. So the topics that we're going to discuss over the next 3 days are basically divided as follows. Today, we're going to deal with the question of if, in fact, it is the case that the introduction of artificial intelligence into the workplace will or might put significant number of people out of work. Is that a problem? One, to develop such technology, and two, is even if you want to say the development of the technology is neutral, is there ethical / halachic problems that you need to address in terms of the adoption of those technologies? If in fact they are going to put people out of work? That's going to be today's question. Tomorrow's question is going to be in cases when people are in fact put out of work. And as Lisa will talk about, there definitely are professions that are very exposed to AI. Well, for some, that just means they need to change the way they work. There will be people who will be put out of work. That's always true. As we'll see one of the examples today, that Rabbi Weiss is a fan of quoting. Right, the invention of cars may have increased the possibilities of employment, but it definitely put people out of work whose employment was being drivers on horse and buggies. Right, so there are going to be people who are put out of work. So tomorrow we'll deal with the questions of what are the responsibilities of both employers who are faced with the question of whether they should adopt technology that will make some of their own staff redundant. What responsibilities do they have for them as they are getting rid of their jobs? And the second part of that will be, what responsibility does society have if there's a significant number of people who are facing that issue, right? What values inform our thought process as we figure out how we relate to the people who are in fact displaced from their previous profession. And then day 3, we're going to imagine again, I don't know whether it's worst or best case scenario, but if in fact AI is finally the technology that will eliminate the need for work, either entirely or mostly. And again, it might not be AI, it might be some other technology, but let's just imagine there is a technology that will get us to that point. Do we have a vision for the world in which work, which has been so central to the human experience, simply doesn't exist, right? Where do we find meaning in our life, right? So many of us find meaning in our jobs, in our vocations. Even if we don't love our job, it takes up a significant percentage of most of our days. If in fact we have reached the point where we have a technology that eliminates that reality and diminishes that part of the human experience, do we have a language to describe what our life should be like if that is in fact the case? So that's the plan for the next 3 days. The plan for today is that before I weigh in with some thoughts about the halachic issues and the value issues, Dr. Lisa Simon is going to present on the question of practically, what are we talking about? What professions are most exposed? And when we talk about professions that are exposed to the impact of AI, what professions does that mean that they're just going to change the way they work, maybe even making them faster and more effective? And what professions are they exposed in such a way that it may eliminate the need for that profession at all. So that's going to be Dr. Simon's presentation. I'm very excited that she's here with us to talk about the practical issues. And then at the end, we'll after we go through some of the Torah sources, we'll have a chance to have a conversation, myself, Dr. Simon, and all of you.
Thank you so much. Okay, Dr. Simon, turn over to you. Thanks for being with us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. So my name is Lisa. Please call me Lisa. Dr. Simon is my mother, and makes me feel old. Let me just go ahead and share my screen right here and share these slides. So thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I'm really, really glad to be here. Oops, I don't actually want this to be a slideshow. Oops, just one more second. Okay. So I'm a labor economist by training, and I think I will give a little bit of a different perspective to this whole issue of what is the impact of AI on labor. I work at a tech company, and I'm sort of quite a I would say optimistic outlooker on what technology can do to work and society, but of course also it's not all rosy, and there definitely are issues. But I think what I just want to introduce today is really a framework to think about what the impact of AI, or really any technology, can be on work, and that is by basically breaking down work into their atomical parts that we call activities or tasks, and essentially figuring out to what extent a particular job or industry or whatever the unit of analysis that you choose to have is. So I just want to start, and Rabbi Ziring has sort of alluded to that a little bit, is the impact of automation on the labor market historically. The interesting thing about AI is that it's quite different from previous waves of automation, and I just want to sort of think a little bit through past waves of automation and what they've typically tended to do to the labor market or to particular occupations. So I'm sure some of you know this image. I definitely haven't made that. I just sort of stole it, but it gives you an overview of sort of the big waves of innovation over the past few centuries, that start with water power and textiles, over to steam and rail, then electricity, petrochemicals, and then sort of starting, and of course much of the point here is that these waves of automation and innovation become shorter and shorter, right? If you think about how long it took between the introduction of computers to AI, that's an increasingly short time span. And just sort of new technologies coming out at a quicker and quicker pace. So that, I think, is something that makes these waves of automation, as they roll around today, particularly impactful, because they're just so quick, right? It feels like sometimes people have only just wrapped their head around sort of the latest introduction of a technology when the next one rolls around. And I imagine, especially sort of the longer people have been in the workforce, that can feel somewhat, overwhelming or sort of exhausting. But let's think a little bit about how these different waves of automation, I'm not going to talk about all of them in detail, but just very, very broadly, right? Like when we think about sort of for example, the electrification of say sort of assembly lines. So what that did is sort of going from if you think about the Ford assembly lines in production, what that did is go from an automobile being extremely expensive to of course, sort of attainable by the masses, and that was done through mass production, and basically figuring out that you can break down the tasks of building a car into manual routine tasks, right? And they were partially automated, but a lot of it was just sort of breaking it all down and having the same people do the same task over and over and over again. What that did sort of, macroeconomically, of course, it sort of might have put some people out of work that were building the cars and the old style. But by and large, that is a technology that, of course, sort of increased output, made goods cheaper, and had sort of massive job creation impacts, right? If you think about the amount of people that went to work at factories and got these jobs, right? So it's not always that, like we've mentioned that automation is labor replacing. Sometimes it can also just create a ton of new work, while perhaps still, putting certain people out of work. Another big sort of and sort of within the same idea, what does robotization do, right? So if we think about sort of further in the work of manufacturing, what a robot can do is lift heavy things from A to B, but also automate repetitive tasks. So then the part that a lot of what the workers were doing, on the assembly lines, could now be done by robots, right? And that's because they figured out how to do these routine manual tasks. And by routine manual, we mean, obviously routine, so everything that is repetitive, and manual because those were things that people were doing by hands. We actually know that robotization per se does have a labor replacing effect. There's a study that sort of shows that the usage of one industrial robot in US manufacturing, I think, replaces, forget the exact number, I believe it's sort of 3.5. It's sort of 4 workers on average, I think, was the effect that was found. What's always been very, and that's for the US. So that's a US based study, actually done by the professor who just got the Nobel Prize in Economics, Daron Acemoglu. The interesting thing is that they did that same study in a European context and didn't find a labor replacing effect. So I think that's something that I want to, like, we can sort of put to the end of the discussion, is if you think about US employment law and European employment laws, they're obviously very, very different. And that is just to say that societies and policymakers can have a say in the impact that those things have on the macroeconomy and employment. So it's not that it is absolutely true that something does have a labor replacing or augmenting effect. Finally, if we think about computerization or software or anything that comes with the digitization age, there it's more and more, and this is basically like AI is computerization on steroids essentially. But what software and computers can do is not automate the routine manual task, but the routine cognitive task, right? So really the first computer was a big calculator, right? And what's calculation but a mental or cognitive routine performance. So I would argue that, of course, computerization had some labor displacing effects as well, but by and large, it didn't sort of put people out of work as whole occupations. It was more that, a secretary would now type on a computer as opposed to a typewriter, and that would have made some part of her life, I'm showing my own gender biases here, her or his life, but historically that was probably true. So yeah, the automation of routine cognitive tasks, and mostly made life easier. Now, the interesting thing about all of these things, or all of these past impacts on employment, is that they typically hit occupations that were at mostly sort of the lower end of the wage distribution. So if we think about the robotization, hit workers really in factories and people doing routine manual tasks. And computerization, slightly higher end of the wage distribution for routine cognitive tasks, but still not sort of your, not the doctors and the lawyers of the world that were impacted. And I think this is really where AI is different, and is probably why it's sort of occupying such a large space, in circles such as these, and a lot of the people that I deal with, is that AI is different, and that is because it is very good at essentially automating cognitive non-routine tasks. And cognitive non-routine tasks is presumably everything that a lot of us are dealing with. It's the things that we output and have expertise in terms of either thinking through complex problems, performing brain surgery, although I would argue that there's a manual part to that, but it is these more cognitive tasks. And that's because AI is good at quite different things than the previous waves of automation. It's very good at pattern recognition, at prediction, at also now with the waves of generative AI, language models and content generation, right? So ChatGPT is excellent at spitting out text and actually generating content. And those tasks are typically those that are associated with occupations at the upper end of the wage distribution. And so this is where I really want to jump into some of the analysis that I have done. I will leave you here some sources on the economics of automation, in case you sort of just want to read through a little bit more in terms of the economics of automation that have been published. You'll notice, maybe you recognize some of these names here. Dr. Acemoglu, Nobel Prize this year, David Card, Nobel Prize in Economics 2 years ago. So, this is definitely sort of a topic that top economists have grappled with for quite a while. So I'm not proposing anything radically new in the way that we measure the impact of AI on labor markets at Revelio. We've just sort of developed a technology that makes it easier to measure and sort of makes it a little bit more granular in terms of how we can measure that. I don't want to bore you with too many details, but I hope to sort of just give you like the idea of the framework that we're talking about. So I want to introduce this concept of AI exposure. What is it? It's essentially understanding what part of a job can be performed or enhanced by AI technology. And in order to do that, we want to break down the jobs into, like I said, the atomical parts of a job, which are activities or tasks. And so you can figure out basically for every task, can it be done by the technology, by AI in this case. When I say it can be done, I think there's many different interpretations. This is where this gets from math into something that you need to make a lot of assumptions about. When we say it can be done, is it that AI can do it better than a human? Is it that AI can help the human do it better? or is it just sort of a nice to have? In this case, we're just talking 0 or 1. Can AI do it better or not? But I think in reality, really, there's sort of a whole spectrum even within that. So just bear that in mind when you're seeing sort of numbers that you find suspiciously high in these exposure scores here. This isn't sort of that important to the audience here, but the way we propose to do this is allows it to make very company specific and insights for benchmarking. So if a company really wanted to know how they do in terms compared to their competitors, what we're showing here could be used for that, which is basically sort of the part of innovation over existing methods of measuring this. Why does it matter, to companies as well as workers? I think it helps us understand to what extent AI, makes people perhaps more productive. It can help HR leaders think through where perhaps in the future you can plan for fewer headcounts, right? So there we are perhaps talking about that labor replacing or displacing effect, and where is AI disrupting? We can also figure out where is it a distraction. And in many cases, there are occupations that are jumping on this bandwagon without really much benefit from adopting AI. And my framework also helps think through that. Okay, so how do we do it? And again, I don't want to sort of bore you too much with the details, but I do think it's quite interesting at how we actually get at these numbers. So just a very practical look at what it is we're actually talking about. So here we have the image of two sources of work activities. And by work activities, of course, we just mean job descriptions. So on the left-hand side, we have just the screenshot of someone that works at Bristol Myers Squibb. Yeah. All right. So on the left, it's basically a screenshot of someone's LinkedIn profile, actually, where they're describing their work activity or their everything that they do in their job. It's essentially a screenshot of a resume, and then on the right we have a job description, a job opening. And you'll notice these bullet points where people talk about what it is that they actually do in their job. The problem is that this type of text is, of course, incredibly hard to work with because there will be as many bullet points as there are people writing about their jobs. So it's an incredibly messy corpus of text. So what we do is essentially tame this massive corpus of text into something that we call a hierarchical activity taxonomy. So essentially, we're through AI actually, so AI, a large language model help us, wrangle this into a library of activities that we can order and sort of hierarchically and flexibly put together, so that for every one of these bullet points here, we can sort of find the clean version and the standardized version that this corresponds to. And the nice thing then is that we can, of course, compare these jobs and occupations across the board. So we can compare the dentist in terms of their activities to this workforce planner. What you can then, if you sort of dive into some of these levels here, these are some of the things that you can see. For example, analyze data to optimize business processes might be one of these activities that we're seeing within occupations. Now, the nice thing about this is that in the end, we're sort of left with roughly 1,500 or so activities that we can classify into being able to be done by AI or not. And in a very first pass, when I first sort of did that, I actually just asked ChatGPT to tell me, do you think you can do this better than a human or not? We've since sort of refined this a little bit and also talked to experts and so far. But by and large, it's basically think about it as yes, collect, process, and manage rental payments in property management is not something that AI can do better than a human, but collect, analyze, and report data in various business operations is actually something that AI can comfortably do. I mean, we can talk about the better than a human, but it is possible in any case. And that was sort of the original ChatGPT prompt, but in any case, I think this is sort of the final result. There's sort of a flip side to exposure. So exposure is really sort of this idea of, could this be done? The idea of adoption is more, do people actually use it in reality? And the way we identify whether people are actually using the technology in reality is essentially by checking whether they mention any of these keywords in one of their job descriptions. So this is sort of a non-exhaustive list of the most popular AI tools. Okay, and so then let's get to the juicy part. So which occupations are actually the most AI exposed when we're using this methodology that I just proposed? And it turns out that that occupations in tech and finance are the ones that are actually the most exposed to AI. So these are jobs such as database administrator, information security, infrastructure engineer, and so forth. Why is that? It turns actually out that ChatGPT is excellent at writing and debugging code. I use ChatGPT on a daily basis to write my to write basically my code to wrangle the data and get it to help me to either debug it or actually just solve really complex problems that I probably would have to think about for half an hour while ChatGPT sort of spits me out the answer and it works really, really quickly. So the interesting part to me personally is that sort of the proliferation of how ChatGPT has actually entered work now is very, very different to how we were thinking about it back when I even think back in 2019 or 2018 when I first started working on this topic, where we were thinking about it from sort of a more high-level perspective in terms of what AI can do, which is like pattern recognition and prediction. But I think it was a little bit harder to grasp. And of course that's still true, but I think just the fact that the dominant technology available today is this this generative part of AI has sort of made it a lot more clear that some of these occupations are more exposed than, say, what we were saying back in 2019 is radiologist is the most exposed occupation because what does AI do is pattern recognition, and radiologists recognize pattern for a living. That might still hold, but it's not sort of as immediate as some of these occupations. It's also interesting to me that it's not writer, right? If you think about like what AI, is or ChatGPT is like immediately good at is writing, but it just turns out that there's still sort of more value to writers actually doing the writing themselves. While code is code, right? Code doesn't really matter who writes it as long as it runs and does the job. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this like particularly high exposure in some of these very, very technical roles. And then the flip side are these low exposed roles, right? So basically what occupations don't really have to think about, being AI exposed too much: restaurant managers, crew members, coaches, corporate trainers, medical reps. They are all occupations that are either very manual or very social. Basically people that need to be somewhere in person, providing a service, or basically in person providing a service, I think is a good summary of these low exposed roles. The flip side of adoption looks very similar, actually. So the occupations that are actually, in fact, using AI to the highest extent now are also very technical ones. So the data scientists, data engineers, and analysts. And then, the people that aren't worrying about this too much just yet are also fairly similar occupations, but not quite. So they're not like exactly the same ones. And so I think the best way of, actually comparing this is putting these two metrics of AI exposure and adoption on two axes, and thinking about this in a 2x2. I like to call this this graph the AI productivity matrix, but you can also think about it as sort of what do occupations have to gain from AI exposure, essentially. I've split this graph into 4 quadrants, basically median splits of these respective metrics. And you can interpret these colors as follows. So the blue here are occupations that are highly exposed to AI and are also adopting at pretty high rates, right? So they're high in adoption, high in exposure. So the data engineers and data analysts, they are really, exposed, but they're also adopting this technology a lot. And so the way I think about it is that these are really the people that are leveraging AI in their jobs, and they have a really high propensity of doing a lot with it. So in my mind, these are people that are making themselves more productive, right? So I think this is really where AI doesn't actually have a labor replacing effect on the data engineer that is using AI. Where AI might have a labor replacing effect is on the data engineer in this category here that doesn't use AI. I think that's the way I think about it, right? So this data engineer here using it is potentially making themselves 30-40% more productive. I mean, if we're taking this literally, it's 60% more. I don't quite think that it's sort of a one-to-one relationship, but that is sort of the idea that they can do a lot more with their time using ChatGPT because they can basically outsource a lot of the tasks that they do in their jobs to an AI tool. And now I think the important part is that the rest of the time they can spend on things where they really, really add value as a human being. And I think that's the part that gets sort of underappreciated in terms of when we're talking about AI being a labor augmenting technology. So if, within a job, you can get rid of all the repetitive tasks and all the really annoying things that you don't really want to do anyway, and then you can focus the rest of your time on the things that you can really, actually add value to as a human being. I think that's an incredibly powerful idea. So, the actual sort of thinking through hard problems and building solutions through, the more, social, ethical, and moral implications of what it is that you're building, perhaps. The social interaction of making your, I talked a lot to auditors in the past months, and they're very worried about, losing their jobs because there are, entire systems that are essentially complete auditing systems, and they have a very, very high exposure score and not such a high adoption score themselves. But I kept telling people that, the part that can be done by AI are really sort of the very repetitive parts of auditing. It's the analytics part and the reporting. What you'll still need is someone that tells the story of the numbers, that actually, talks the client through what these numbers mean, the one that, goes through the edge cases and thinks through solutions that aren't necessarily sort of easily graspable by what the software spits out. So, just some thoughts in terms of what, this group of occupations here means. Then this green part is an interesting one because they're sort of, in my mind, the overly eager adopters of AI. Funnily enough, here we have recruiters and content specialists. So the green are occupations that don't actually have a very high exposure, right? They sort of have below median exposure, but they have above median adoption. So they're sort of jumping on this bandwagon of using AI, but they don't actually have such a high, return from using it. So basically, maybe they're overdoing it perhaps a little bit. Then the yellow is are those occupations that don't really have to worry about AI. They have a very low exposure, and they are also not really using AI at all. So basically, all fine in that respect. The restaurant managers or foremen. I mean, probably depends what type of foreman and where. But yeah, basically, if your occupation is within here, don't worry about it. And then there's the red part. And the red part, I think, is this sort of where a lot of the discussion today might lead. These are the occupations that are highly exposed, but aren't adopting anything, or are hardly adopting. And so, if you think about the two occupations that are, the data analyst here, and perhaps the financial advisor that is down here. What's the difference? Well, they have the same sort of propensity of being able to do parts of their jobs by AI, but in reality, they're just not doing that. And I think the danger of being down here is that other people might come in and propose, apps and software and tools that are basically displacing these occupations here. So, if you're not using AI as a financial advisor yourself, someone might offer, a tool that is leveraging AI and might, have more of a labor replacing effect sort of from the outside as opposed to from within the occupation, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's sort of the main bit. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I'm just going to go through sort of two more ideas, and then I'll finish there. I think the interesting part, and that's something that I've mentioned a few times before, is that this is obvious. I mean, I think if you saw this relationship here is very obvious now that the more highly exposed your an occupation is, the higher the salaries on average, and that's quite a steep line there, where really, it's really the high end of the wage distribution that is most exposed. So your software engineers and mechanical engineers up here, and then your driver and cashiers down here that aren't as highly exposed. What's interesting is that there's also a positive relationship to adoption. So basically, this is actually true for when we sort of look at the same occupation and the same exposure score. So say, two financial advisors, A and B, one's using AI, one isn't using AI. The interesting bit is that the person using AI, on average, earns 8% higher salaries to the one that isn't, so within the same occupation. And that has some very interesting, implications for, of course, for equity and fairness and so forth, that I think are also very, very important to consider. And especially sort of, there's an interesting gender gap when we're talking about AI that I think is worth perhaps highlighting here. So by and large, first of all, men are actually more exposed to AI than women. And that's not the gender gap that's interesting here. This is just because men are more highly represented in roles that tend to be more highly exposed. So here we just have the share of men and women in some of the most highly exposed roles. So infrastructure engineers, IT specialists, software engineers, just traditionally roles in which there's a much higher male share than females. So that's not the point. But the thing is that men are also adopting AI more. And if we're just sort of looking at the averages, it's basically twice as much as women on average, not holding constant anything else. And that's of course highly driven by the fact that they also have a lot more opportunity to do so in their jobs. But what is really interesting is that when we look at men and women in the same roles and the same exposure scores, men are still adopting more AI. So, basically, almost a whole percentage or, over half a percentage point higher adoption for men than women. And given that what I just told you about the 8% higher salaries, right, I think that's an interesting implication for downstream effects of how AI could impact equity in terms of gender as well. Okay, I think I will skip through all of this. It's basically highlighting the same things, but just breaking it down into different metrics other than occupations. You can also think about AI exposure in terms of skills. And it follows a very, very similar pattern. You can also think about it in terms of entire industries, right? So actual but basically what you would classify companies into as opposed to occupations. And the list goes on in terms of looking at this by seniority or education level. I think the education level is a really interesting one because we're sort of seeing that basically some of the most highly exposed roles or highly exposed people are basically people with really, really high degrees. Interestingly, sort of goes back down again at the doctorate degree, because I suppose AI can't quite just yet write papers as well, but it's sort of a very, very different pattern from what we're seeing before. Let me just close out with maybe some sort of closing thoughts on this. I think, AI has many, many upsides. It can make people, more productive. It can automate annoying and repetitive tasks, and can just lead to higher productivity and effectiveness of individual workers. So I think those are some of the big upsides. Now, there's definitely also downsides to this, and I think they come in more at sort of a macro level, right? So this is the upsides are sort of personal to the people using AI. The downsides are basically macro effects to people not using it, or sort of entire economies or industries or local labor markets that in these even for the data engineers in the high, the blue area that I highlighted there, even for those, if these data engineers make themselves so much more productive, there'll come a point in which the companies employing them will realize that you can do more with less workers, and probably hire a fewer of these data engineers, because you can do more with less. And most likely what will happen is that they will keep their most experienced and best engineers that know how to use it, and also know how to coordinate between workers. I think one of the things that I forgot to mention that gets underappreciated and perhaps makes these exposure scores higher than they are in reality is the coordination of tasks. And I think every one of us will appreciate this fact that you'll have a long to-do list of things that you want to achieve in any given day, but actually putting them all together and prioritizing what you're going to do first, and then basically putting it all together into a final product is actually maybe something that is also pretty, pretty complex and maybe is missing from the explicit tasks of individual tasks. So basically, I'm saying the activities don't exist in a vacuum or independently. But so anyway, I think the people that will likely, stay are the ones that are highly experienced and know how to coordinate tasks. And that might have downstream implications for education and talent pipelines, right? So if you're thinking about the auditors that I speak to quite a lot, they're senior auditors that have a lot of experiences and have seen a lot of things and really know where to provide the value add. They'll be fine. But what about people trying to get into the profession and, students of accounting and finance that sort of want to get to there. There might just be a little bit less need for them in the future if a lot of these repetitive tasks in which people really learn how to do the profession get automated away. I don't think we're sort of I'm painting an overly grim picture here. I don't actually think it's sort of all that that stark, but it is definitely worth thinking about that, there might be downstream effects that have impact on education and talent pipelines. And then, of course, there's a lot of other things that you want to consider about downsides of AI, such as data privacy concerns, accuracy and fairness, right? A lot of the output generated by AI really depends on the data that it's trained at. If that has, inherent biases, be it on gender, ethnicity, religion, you have it, there will be biases in the output as well. That's not sort of so much an impact on work, but I think it is definitely worth thinking about. Then I just want to leave you with a few closing thoughts that, I've basically described a very practical and technical picture of what this looks like. But then, maybe more back to the topic of this seminar is that, people have choices and societies have choices. And if you remember the example of the robots and the industrial robots implications in Europe versus the US and how they were different, that's because there are different policies in place, right? So the EU or the US, just two contexts that I happen to be very familiar with, are very, very different. And that is also true when it comes to the regulation and, sort of welcoming of AI. I think the first thing that the EU Parliament did was, jump in and sort of build a compendium of AI regulation. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think depends just on your point of view in terms of whether how much you want to protect and regulate versus spur innovation and so forth. But that is just to say that there are different approaches, and you don't have to let AI do whatever it wants. And that's true for adoption and also how much value societies place on work, right? There are tools that policymakers have to also create incentives in terms of how much you tax labor versus capital, and yeah, just basically how much you want societies to work and not work. I think that's all the points that I wanted to make. I'll just leave out these key takeaways here. But basically, just the three main things are that AI is different from previous waves of automation. The framework that I presented here is to break down jobs into their atomical parts of activities and figuring out, which parts of a technology can do which parts of a job. Mostly, we're talking really about changing, basically reshuffling tasks within an occupation in order to then spend more time on the things that really matter. And I think, yeah, basically there are downstream effects that this technology will have that I am eager to discuss with you further. let me stop here. I think I've taken more than my allotted time, but thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to hand it right over to Rabbi Ziring, and then we'll have opportunity for questions and for conversation following his presentation. So, Jonathan.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lisa, for really setting out the issues. So as Lisa noted, really the key question that we have to discuss today is really about adoption in cases where the adoption of AI is going to put a significant percentage of people out of a job. To put it in a way that someone asked me as an actual practical question, someone who was hired as a consultant for a company to figure out how they could save money by automating part of the tasks, some of the tasks that are done by their employees, so that they could minimize the number of people on payroll. And he asked me, is that unethical, right? Meaning he's advocating for the adoption of it. So, and again, Lisa really laid out the issues of which, that which professions are most exposed, and even in the ones that are exposed, it's a choice as to whether or not someone chooses to adopt them. But obviously, the most direct case in which you have to think about the ethical issues is where, not theoretically, very practically, that by adopting this technology, whether it be AI or really any technology, you will be putting people out of work. And again, you can ask a similar question about what are the concerns that one should have in developing technology that one knows can be used in that way. But that's one step removed, right? Because you can always say that I can develop technology that might put people out of work. And then whether we adopt it is a question to deal with later on. But obviously they are related questions, because if you develop a technology that someone will adopt to replace somebody's job, then you still have to ask of whether that is okay. So the topic we're going to discuss today that really grapples with that question is what's colloquially known as colloquially known as hasagat gvul, the encroachment onto someone's boundaries, but in formal halachic language is really yored lumanot chavero, is descending in, impinging on somebody's profession. And when is that problematic? When is it problematic to do something that takes away someone else's job? So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the basic sources, get the ideas out there, and then at the end we'll have questions, both for me, for Lisa, between us, and from all of you. But just to sort of get the halachic issues on the table. So even though colloquially this is known as hasagat gvul, technically, if you look at source 1, hasagat gvul refers to the very technical prohibition in the land of Israel where there were ancestral plots of land. So if you and your neighbor have, let's say, a fence or border markers that go along your property line, and you move the border marker in the middle of the night by a few feet so that you have a little bit of extra space for your vegetable garden, that is prohibited because of hasagat gvul. You have literally moved your border marker and you've taken their land, right? Lo tasig gvul re'acha asher gavlu rishonim b'nachlatcha asher tinchal ba'aretz asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha lirishta. Do not move your neighbor's border marker, which the original ones have said, in your inheritance, which you shall inherit in the land that the Lord your God has given to you to possess. And anyone who wants the sources there in the chat, I just find it's easier for me to not share it on the screen, because then I can see people if they have questions and the like. Despite the fact that this is not the original context, there is a tradition going back to the medieval period that doing something to compete with someone in a way that destroys their job, ruinous competition practices, is also referred to as hasagat gvul, and that's what I gave you here in number 2, in the Tshuvot of the Maharshal, Rosh Luria, citing Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, the Rokeach. He writes, Katav HaRokeach, Anyone who sabotages his fellow's livelihood is within the curse of moving his fellow's border. And many people were shocked at this. This prohibition of not moving a border marker refers very specifically to real estate in Israel. But it seems like he had a tradition. Elsewhere, though, as I said, the Talmud refers to this prohibition more formally as Yored Lumanot Chaveros. You have in number 3, in the Gemara in Makot Daf Chav Daled, also in Sanhedrin Pe Aleph, Lo Asal Re'eu Ra'a, when listing ways in which someone was righteous. So one of them is he didn't act evilly. What is the epitome of evil that someone would avoid? Shelo Yarad Lumanot Chavero. He did not descend, he did not enter his friend's livelihood. He didn't compete in a way that destroyed his friend's job. Okay. In order to figure out the parameters of this, we need to see the central text in number 4. And what I want you to keep in mind as we go through it is how much does this passage really indicate a prohibition on opening businesses, developing strategies that might benefit you, might even benefit society, but will put people out of jobs, right? And I want you to think about whether this speaks to the issues we're talking about, right? Whether that the development of technology that might put people out of jobs, or the adoption of technology that will put people out of jobs, or as Lisa mentioned, adopting technology that will inhibit new people from entering the field, right? Won't necessarily make people lose jobs who already established and had the expertise to utilize these tools, but the people at the beginning of the task who might do things which are more routine and monotonous, therefore they might not be able to enter into that space. Does this central text speak to that? So this is the Talmudic passage in Bava Batra, Chaf Aleph to Chaf Bet, 21 to 22. And it says as follows: Amar Rav Huna, Hai bar mivoa duuki rechaya. There was a certain resident of an alleyway, and he set up a mill. Right? He was a miller. He ground flour, or he ground grain into flour. Va'ata bar mivoa chavre b'kamuki gabe. And another resident of the same alleyway came and also opened a business to grind people's grain into flour. The Talmud rules, Dina hu dema'kevi lave, the first person who was there, who made his living by grinding the grain, can stop the other person from opening up his business. He says, you're destroying my job. You're destroying my livelihood. So the Talmud says, okay, lema misayele, let us try to support this notion that you can be limited from engaging in certain practices that will destroy someone else's profession. From the following, marchikim mitzudat hadag min hadag kimelo ritzat hadag. If someone wants to be a fisherman, he has to set the nets far enough away from other fishermen who are already fishing, the distance that a fish would normally swim. Whatever that's defined as, but basically let's assume that the average fish in his normal day swims in, I don't know, a 500-meter radius, 1,000-meter radius. So, and a fisherman has already set his net there. So the next boat that wants to go out and set the nets has to set it the 500 meters away. Now, the interesting thing already is that we now have an expansion. Right, that the Talmud starts with a very particular limit on competition. I can't set up to be a miller in the same alleyway as another miller. In the second case, and the reason the first case is because I am presumably diminishing the number of customers rather, that the first person will get. In the second case, that's not what's happening. Is I'm taking away their fish. Already what we see here is that the Talmud seems to have an expansive notion of limits on competition because these are very different, right? One of them is you are minimizing the profit that the other person can make by diminishing their customer base. The second one is that you're diminishing how much they'll have to sell. But the Talmud equates them, which seems to point to a meta value, which is you can't engage in activities that will destroy someone else's profession. So the Gemara says, "V'kama, how much is this space?" I just gave the example of meters, but the Gemara says, "Amar Rabba bar Huna ad parsa." So the Gemara then, after suggesting this, which implies that there's a meta value, don't do something that will destroy someone's profession and make them not make as much money. The Gemara says, no, these are different. Shiny dagim, diyava sierra. The fish case is different because fish look around. And once the fish explores the area, right, all the other fish are going to follow. So the Talmud doesn't reject the equation fundamentally, but it suggests that there's a difference between diminishing how much someone can make and destroying them, right? And the Talmud, at least at this point, assumes that if you set a fisherman's net too close to another fisherman's net, you run the risk of not just diminishing how much money they make, but destroying them completely, because now all the fish will follow. Okay? So the Talmud says that's worse, right? That's worse. You can't prove from the fact that you can't essentially steal someone's fish, even though it's not theft, but prevent their ability from getting any fish, to the less extreme case, where you just diminish their customer base. So then, Amar le Ravina le Rava, Lema Rav Huna to Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Let's say that Rav Huna's position, who limits the ability of someone to open up a mill in an alleyway where there's a pre-existing mill, is following the position of Rabbi Yehuda. Titnan, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Lo yichalek chen v'ni klayot ve'gozin latinokot. Rabbi Yehuda now moves to a third way that you could hurt someone's business, right? The first is by attacking their customer base. The second is by attacking their ability to get product to sell. The third is by being better at advertising, and therefore diminishing how much money they make by pulling people through advertising. So you're not allowed to give out nuts and, right, that was the equivalent of candy. You're not allowed to give out nuts to people's kids, which draws the parents into the store as well. And the Chachamim permit this. So the Talmud at this point says maybe those who allow advertising and swag, whatever exactly it is, right? Free tastings, right? All sort of that group of tricks that we use to get people to come and buy from us and the like. If you oppose that, that's because you think you can't impinge on someone else's business, and if you permit that, then you think you can. And then again, the Talmud splits them, and he says, no, afilu tema rabbanan. Even the rabbis say that will agree that you can limit the miller, even though they are in favor of advertising. Why? Because they say very simply, ad tam lo pligi rabbanan le derbiyudatam el damar le anakam amagoze ad plog shivaske. He said, listen, so you give out free nuts, I'll give out fruit. You know, you advertise in this way, I'll advertise in that way. Right? You do a buy one, get one free, and I'll do a 50% off. Advertising, all these gimmicks, you can't stop me from advertising, because you could do it also. Now this puts a twist in it, because what this says is that the Talmud thinks that there's a difference between destroying one's profession when they don't have the ability to compete, right? When they don't have the ability to basically do the same thing as you, that the Talmud says the Chachamim are totally okay with, right? If they have the ability to do it and they just choose to be lazy, they choose not to be creative, that's their problem, right? And that doesn't mean that just because we allow you to be creative in a case where they could compete with you, that doesn't mean we're going to allow you to do the exact same thing they're doing in their space, right, and compete with them that way. So the Gemara says, okay, Rabbi here, so again, the Gemara challenges it. You're allowed to open a store immediately next to your friend's store, or a bathhouse next to your friend's bathhouse. You can't be stopped. Right now, the Talmud says, what are you talking about? I can't stop someone from opening up a store next to me, right? I like to give the example when I was in YU, right? So anyone who's ever been to YU knows that there are two pizza places across the street from YU, and they're both there. There's Grandma's and Lake Pomo's Pizza. They're literally next door. But what's the problem, right? I'll make pizza in my store. You make pizza in your store. That's, there's no problem with that. So the Talmud then says, you're right. This question is a dispute amongst the Tanaim. Tanaihi, Titania, Kofin b'nei hamivaot zeh shlolo shiv b'neihen lo chayev lo bursaki lo melamed tinoko. The members of an alleyway can prevent tailors or tanners or teachers from moving in or opening shop really. You can stop someone from coming in from the outside, but you can't stop the people who already live there. Right? So now the Talmud introduces another aspect here, which is that the entire framing of the second chapter of Bava Batra is about zoning laws. Right? Is what responsibilities do I have to those around me? And the Talmud said, listen, if we already have an established imagine like a homeowner society, right? We already have our rules for our little co-op. One of us runs the barber shop within this co-op, and one of us has the little grocery store. So we can decide to not let someone else move in and open. But once we're both in here, we have our rights, and you can't stop the people who already live here from opening a business. But Rav Shimon ben Gamliel Omar Af l'shcheno kofei. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says no, even your neighbor, you're allowed to stop. And Amar Rav Huna berei de Rav Yoshua pshitali. It is clear to me the following: that barmata acharite matzimake. It depends on the concentric circles. If I live in one city and someone's coming from another city, we can stop them from coming in and opening a business that'll compete. We'll say, listen, we already have a pizza store here. You can't open another one if they come up from a completely different city. V'i shayach but now the Talmud adds yet another factor and says, but if they have to pay taxes, right? Meaning the norm was that insiders paid taxes and outsiders did not. And therefore, outsiders had a built-in advantage that was unfair. So the Talmud says, look, it makes sense. You can't allow someone who has an unfair advantage, meaning they're artificially coming in and they have lower overhead. That's not fair. But if they have to pay taxes and therefore they come from outside, but they now pay the same taxes as you, and therefore they're subject to the exact same constraints as you, so then lo matzimake, he can't be stopped. Bar mevoa dinavshe, and if two people live in the same alley and therefore they have the same rights, lo matzimake, you can't stop them because you have equal rights. Who says that just because I opened the pizza store yesterday that I have the right to stop a second one from opening? We both live here. We can both do whatever we want. Boy, Rav Huna Brei Rav Yoshua, and then the Talmud asks, bar mevoa acharita. Okay, what about the middle case? You live in different alleyways, right? Their houses were zoned in such a way that you had like these units of a few houses that open to a courtyard would open into an alleyway, and then those alleyways would open into the main thoroughfares. So what if someone lives in the same city, but he comes from another little complex of homes? Can he be stopped as if he's an outsider, or is he an insider? So the Gemara says, Teku, I don't know. And then the Gemara says there are certain exceptions. There are certain exceptions where we put no limits on competition. The first example the Gemara says is Amar of Yosef, teachers of young children can't stop other teachers from coming in. Why? Amar Mar, Kinat Sofrim, Tarbeh Chochma. The reason is because basically the competition amongst teachers is good, right? People will feel the pressure. They'll be better teachers if they know there's competition. And then the Now there's bracketed things which here which may the text is a little bit unclear. I'll read what's in the brackets as well. That Ezra tiken lahem Yisrael shiu moshiven sofer b'tzat sofer. That Ezra specifically allowed teachers to compete with other teachers. And the Gemara said, well, aren't we worried that if teachers come and compete against each other, don't you feel like people will get, will give up, right? They'll just give up because, what's the point? Someone else came in and is competing. And that's where the Talmud comes in and says, Kinat Sofrim Tarbeh Chachma, that the jealousy of teachers increases wisdom, and therefore we don't put limits on competition amongst teachers. And then the Talmud gives another one, which is we don't put limits on traveling salesmen, right? Because it's temporary. I won't read that inside, but basically the Talmud said specifically traveling salesmen, especially ones who sold cosmetics. Apparently this was very hard to come by, and they didn't want it to make it that women wouldn't have access to cosmetics, and therefore they allowed these temporary salesmen to compete without limitation. Then the Talmud puts a few more limitations on Talmud scholars who are also businessmen, but I'll leave that for now. I know I ran through that relatively quickly, but I wanted just to get the broad picture. Now, I saw that in the chat, someone asked, well, does this show that the Torah is against capitalism? Well, that's really the question at some level, right? Which is, at the very broadest level, what we need to ask here is this question of opening new businesses that will encroach on someone else's. On the one hand, allowing businesses is it's potentially good for consumers. It's potentially good for society, right? It pushes things ahead because people, when they know there's competition, they have to be more creative. On the other hand, the protectionist tendencies here are prioritizing the well-being of the employed, right? Not the consumers, not the buyers, but the employed. And when you first look at this Talmudic passage, it seems like the Talmud is assuming that in the, if you want to call it the, and this is way too much of an oversimplification, but yes, you wanted to call it the capitalism, socialism binary. So it sounds like it's more on the socialist side, right? We want to protect people's jobs, and we don't encourage competition. We don't encourage people, being creative, and the like. Right? That is definitely sort of something you could get if you read the Talmud quickly. However, there are some very important clues in this passage that is not the case. And that is the following. Remember that I mentioned the framing of the second chapter here in Bava Batra is zoning laws, right? Is what responsibilities do I have to my neighbor? Right? I'm not allowed to harm my neighbor by blasting music in the middle of the night. And I'm not allowed to harm my neighbor by opening up a business that creates a terrible smell and makes it uncomfortable for people to live here. Right? That's my neighborly responsibility. That's the context where the Talmud opens up this discussion. And in that context, the Talmud, if you note very carefully, says that the classic case here is not, right, is bar mevoa, right? Is can someone who lives in an alleyway, right, who already has rights, can they stop someone from opening a business? And the Talmud ends up concluding that everyone agrees that if you and your friend both have equal rights to be here, then you can't stop them from opening a company and opening a business, even seemingly if it competes with you. What you can do is prevent outsiders from coming in. Now, that perspective already suggests that it's not so simple, that this is not merely a limit on competition, right? It's a limit on a very specific, very localized type of competition, which is when there was a presumption under which I entered into this space. I bought real estate here. I became a member of the community on the assumption that I would be allowed to do certain things and that I could make my living here. And then an outsider comes in and does something that destroys that expectation. So then I have a legitimate legal right to stop them. But maybe I don't have a right to lack of competition. And as I noted as we were going through the passage, there are moments that call this into question. Right? There are moments that call this into the question, such as when the Talmud compares this to the fish case, where you're both out at sea, but also when it tries to limit certain types of advertising, which seems like a much broader limitation. So the question you need to figure out is the Talmud actually limiting competition? Does it actually not believe in competition because the presumption of rights goes to the workers, right? Those who are employed. Is that really what's happening or not? Let me just read a few more sources. I really do want to have a conversation about it, but I need to get sort of the basic sources out there. So if you look at the Ramah in number 5, Ramosha Isserlis, he writes as follows. He says, first of all, the first thing he notes is that the Talmud here is dealing with a case where it's not for sure that you will harm the other person's business, right? As I mentioned, at least when I was in YU, there were 2 pizza places exactly next to each other that were fully capable of supporting the business of, whatever it was, 1,500 hungry teenage and young 20s boys in YU, plus everyone in MTA. Though someone here texted that apparently this has come up every so often. It does come up that another business opened up there and it came to the Rod of Riverdale, whether it was legitimate. So just because you open a business next door to somebody doesn't mean that it's going to destroy their business. But the Ramah says, let's say it will, right? Let's say what you're doing will absolutely destroy them. You're sure of it. Then the Ramah says that everyone agrees it's forbidden. Now that voice pushes us in the direction of an extreme protectionist ethos of the employee, right? Of not allowing people, right? If you know you're going to destroy it, then everyone agrees that it's forbidden to challenge them. And similarly, if you look at the Pitchei Tshuva, he says dehecha deba asheni lidchot harishon legamrei ulevatel oto mimchiyato. When the second person comes to destroy the first person's business, kulei amamod didematzi make. However, the Ramaya himself adds a very important caveat, and that is that until now we've only been talking about the perspective of the employed, of the small business owners. But what if the second business isn't just coming and offering the same pizza as the first guy at the same price and just diminishing the customer base because whatever, like sometimes I'll go to the one on the left, sometimes I'll go to the one on the right. What if the one comes and he says, I can provide pizza at half the price because whatever, I have access to better wholesalers. I own my own cows and therefore produce the cheese and I have less overhead. Whatever. Once we introduce that factor, then what do we say? And to that, the Ramah says, the Yesh Omrim, aval im noten yoter bizol oshi yoter tova, that if it's a lower price or a better product, so then then they can't stop you, right? So this is a very important qualification, because here the Ramah implies that we're only protectionist in a very limited circumstance, which is if you're not doing anything special, right? You're doing the same thing as the other person in his space, so then we'll stop you. But if you can do it better, you can do it cheaper, So then the benefit to society, the benefit of competition, of making the market, making the economy better and more effective, wins out. And that would imply a very different perspective, right? Because that would imply that our concerns about competition are very limited, right? They're very limited to cases in which the new competitor isn't really doing something that improves society. All they're doing is destroying the business of the other person. And that's where we're going to be upset. But if the competition actually does something to better the situation of the consumers, to better the situation in the economy in general, so then we're going to be okay with it. And that is already implied in the passage that we saw, but I put it here again to remind you that the Talmud itself acknowledged this by educators, right? That the importance of having good educators for the Talmud is so important that we will not protect educators because we want the best teachers for our children. And therefore, we don't want complacent teachers, and therefore, we will allow competition, which means that the Talmud already understood the power of competition. Okay, I want to do one more source and then sort of talk about how this weighs in our question, and then we can open it to conversation. What we've done is the following, right? If we just simplify what we've done, we have the Talmudic passage that at first glance has a very protectionist perspective. It seems, as someone said in the chat, against capitalism. It simply believes that the highest value is to protect people's jobs and livelihoods. If you only had that voice, then you would say, developing a technology, adopting a technology that's going to drive people out of work is bad, right? That's bad. However, then we carve out exceptions. We say that in both directions. First of all, we say that integral to the Talmud's conceptualization of this is one of territory. Meaning, if I have rights by virtue of the fact that I live here and you don't, so that's why I can stop you from competing. This is part of my neighborly, right? This is part of the zoning considerations that we have, is that we protect the livelihoods of the locals. However, outsiders who come in, either temporarily or come in under the same constraints, right? That's the tax passage in the Talmud. We don't stop them. So the first thing to note is that the Talmud's conception of competition isn't universal. It's very specific to where I have rights and you don't. The second is that one that cuts in the direction of protectionism, and that's the Ramah's claim that we're only that lenient if you're going to diminish someone's profits but not destroy them completely. But if you're going to destroy them completely under certain circumstances, we say you can't enter, and we're much more expansive on the protectionist front. But all the way to the other extreme, the Ramah says that, but this is only if the second person can't do it cheaper or better. But if they can do it cheaper or better, then the needs of the consumers, the needs of the economy, of the market, to develop and to provide better services and cheaper services wins out. And that overrides the protectionist concern. Now, one way of looking at this presentation is that the halakha has protectionist elements, meaning we care about people's jobs, but we also care about the economy, we care about consumers. And what we're trying to do is balance between them. That's one perspective. But if you look at number 9, Rav Asher Weiss, a leading authority in Israel, has a very different perspective. And he notes that you learn a lot more from the silence of the Talmud than what it says explicitly. Namely, the entire discussion of the Talmud is very, very limited, right? It's very limited. It's discussing the question of what happens when you have a very narrow geographic space and two people want to open businesses that do basically the same thing. And the question is, can you do that? And once you introduce the Ramah, it's clear that the Talmud is talking about a case where not only are you introducing another pizza store, but you're introducing a pizza store with the same quality pizza at the same price, right? It's as if you're both, I don't know, getting the same pre-made pizzas for the same price, putting it in your ovens, selling it for the exact same price. That's where the Talmud introduces it. The Talmud is completely silent on the question of what if the reason I'm competing with you is not because I'm doing the same thing you are, but because I'm doing something different. And it just happens to be that what I'm doing is different, puts you out of a job. Meaning, I build a car, I invent a car, and now people don't need horse and buggies. That's not the same thing, right? It's true that it can destroy someone's business, but the Talmud isn't even talking about that. The Talmud is talking very specifically where my only novelty is that I opened another store doing the same thing you're doing at the same price in the same place. But he says, Omnam nireh dekol shezeh derech hamishkar v'hitpatchut tiv'it shel kalkala ein yechola lakev. Any time that this is the way of trade and the natural development of the economy, it cannot be delayed. And yesh b'zeh harbei dugmaot b'chayei ha'ma'aseh. And there are many examples in our practical life. I got cut off a little bit here. I'm going to read my English translation here just for speed. He says, right, can you say that if asked whether it's permitted to develop wholesalers and supermarkets out of concern that it'll put the makolet and other small stores to lose their livelihood? Can you forbid cars because it will put wagon drivers who ride horses to lose their livelihood? Would we ban the development of the computer because it would cause masses of stenographers to lose their livelihoods and they would no longer be needed? The same is true for every new invention. Should we forbid the development lest it be fulfilled through it that the old will be taken out because of the new and it will hurt the livelihoods of many? Rather, it is clear that the law is only stated in incidental cases, not with fundamental changes to the means of production in the economy, of production and development. It is further possible that it's only forbidden to undermine the livelihood of one's friend by being involved in the same business as him. However, if you invent something new and through involvement in it, you undermine your friend's livelihood, right, then there's no prohibition at all. Right? We have to be precise in investigating this. It further seems from the later authorities regarding what they wrote about having no permission to undermine another's livelihood, even if there's benefit to the buyers and consumers, that not all cases are equal, and we do not treat them all in the same way. If it becomes clear that there's a real way to lower prices properly while leaving room to make a living, certainly the merchant cannot make the yoke on the community heavier and undermine the masses with the claim that they'll lose their livelihood. Others have the right to compete and lower prices. Only if one lowers prices because it can absorb the losses or loss of profit to attract customers from the other to make him lose his livelihood. In such a case, he may not, even the community would gain. Right? He says, listen, anytime that you can create something new, that you can make a better product, you can change the rules of the game and just make things that are better, obviously that's permitted. The only case he's not sure about is where you are the big guy and you can basically absorb losses until the other person goes out of business. And then what he doesn't state is, and then you can do whatever you want, right? This was one of the concerns that was raised against Uber, right? It was at the beginning, right? Uber seemed to lower prices for taxis, but some of that was artificial because of the introduction of venture capital and the infusion of venture capital that allowed them to do it. And as some of that capital has run out, now the price difference between Uber and taxis in many cities is minimal. But that doesn't change the fact that the introduction of Uber into the market destroyed the livelihood of many cab drivers. So one of my friends said to me that, yeah, maybe that's what Rabbi Weiss is talking about, that you artificially can absorb losses to drive people out of business, and then you end up offering basically the same thing at the same price, but there's no competition. Which, if you've ever read Peter Thiel's book, at some level, that's Peter Thiel's theory of competition, right? Which is you corner a market, create a virtual monopoly, and then you can charge whatever you want. Now, this is not to speak specifically about Uber. It's not clear that that's what happened. It's not clear that they didn't introduce something new. The ease of use of Uber may also, right, even if the prices are similar, the ease of use of Uber may be a factor to consider. But the basic point that Rav Asher Weiss makes here is that it's not that there's protectionist elements and that there's open market elements in the halachic data. It's that the entire notion of competition in the Talmud is limited to cases where you're not introducing something new. You're not even introducing a better price or better product. You're just sort of competing for the sake of competing in a minimal space. And there we recognize the rights of people to make a living based on the job that they already had. And that's only combined with respect for local rights and zoning laws and the like. But if what you're doing is introducing, you're changing the rules of the game, you're making society different, the fact that it may destroy people's livelihoods, which was built on an older model, that Rav Asher Weiss just assumed that obviously no one has ever opposed. No one could oppose in halacha, because that's not even what the Torah, that's not even what the law is talking about. Okay, so let me take 2 more minutes before I open it up to conversation. So how does this play in to what we have now? So I think at first glance, I'd say the following. I think there is no room for forbidding the development of technologies that may one day put people out of work. And that for a few reasons. One is, as Rav Asher Weiss says, the laws of competition as presented in the Talmud are very limited. There seems to be no discussion whatsoever, and it seems to be obviously just assumed that you can't be stopped making the world a better place and developing technologies just because there will be some growing pains. That there will be, to use Schumpeter's phrase, some creative destruction, right? Right. Every creation will destroy something, but you can't forbid all creation just because destruction comes along with it. So definitely at the theoretical stage, I just can't see how the laws of competition can say anything about forbidding developing technologies that might put people out of work. Really, where this question comes up is in the adoption level, right? And that's where things get a little bit more complicated, because if the adoption of a particular technology, if the adoption of AI into a particular industry is going to make it better, like let's say we get to the point that that using AI, we can do a significantly better job than radiologists at spotting cancer early, spotting whatever. I don't think anyone can say that the fact that it might put radiologists out of a job, that's going to be a problem. And adopting it would be fine, right? Would be great. We're going to be saving lives. Where the question will come up more is where adoption of it doesn't necessarily create a better product, doesn't even necessarily doesn't necessarily make things cheaper. It just allows you to lay people off. Then you've got to figure. Then this discussion is at least relevant, because the more protectionist elements here will say, listen, you didn't make things better for the consumers, right? All the benefits were just absorbed by the owner of the company, and you put a bunch of people out of work. If that's the case, then you could definitely see people taking these sources and saying that's not okay. On the other hand, you could see people saying no, right? Why is the owner of a business also not like a consumer, right? He can produce things now cheaper, even if he doesn't pass it on to people. That's not necessarily the case. That he's not allowed to do things more efficiently, right? So that's, I think, where the question is going to be in cases where that's where you're going to have to ask, right? And that's where these topics seem to be relevant. But the honest truth is that in most cases, right, where adoption of any new technology, including AI, makes things more efficient, which again, as Lisa noted, it depends. But let's talk about the cases where it really will, right? Where it will make things cheaper, it'll make them quicker, it will lower the costs, right? You'll be able to, whatever, have your taxes done in half the time for half the price with similar accuracy. In those cases, it's very hard to argue that it would be forbidden. The tricky ethical cases are going to be the ones where you're using AI really to put people out of work without making society fundamentally better, without making things cheaper for consumers. And again, we're going to come back to this more tomorrow, because then the model, it's not clear that these laws directly forbid that. What might be more relevant is, are there other ethical responsibilities that, let's say, employers have to not put their workers out of a job? And again, there are other options, right? It's not just, there are middle options. There's adoption of technology and firing people. There's also, giving people the option to retrain, and things like that are going to be more complicated. That's what we're going to discuss more tomorrow. But what I wanted to sort of just introduce today is the fact that while at first glance the Talmud has protectionist tendencies, where our main concern are people's livelihoods, which would push you in the direction of not creating or at least not adopting technologies that will put people out of work. As Rosh Weiss notes, a careful read is that the laws of competition are limited to cases where you're not creating something new, you're not making things cheaper or better, you're just sort of mimicking what already exists. But when you really are introducing a new technology that can fundamentally shift the rules of the game, it's very hard to argue that that's not just part of the way the economy works. And yes, again, using Schumpeter's term, it is created destruction, but sometimes that's necessary. I mean, it's hard to say that the Talmud would forbid that. What we'll talk about tomorrow is, okay, but where does that leave us? Because there are going to be real people who are going to be harmed, people who are really exposed to these new technologies and who are going to lose their jobs, and it's not going to be easy for them to find another job. We're going to have to talk about what that means for employers who are letting these people go, and for society who, but purely on the competition level, I think that the brunt of the data really pushes in the direction that those protectionist elements just don't apply when something new is being introduced that can really make things better and cheaper and quicker, and just create completely new realities on the ground. That's just not where the Talmud is talking about. The laws of competition are so limited that it seems hard to argue that they would forbid the introduction of any technology that really fundamentally makes things better and more effective, and the like. And again, the devil is in the details, as Lisa noted, that many people are afraid this is what AI is going to do. The reality is much more complicated. That certain professions are not exposed in that way. Certain are exposed, but only in the sense that people will have to learn to utilize these tools to make themselves more effective, but not that they're going to lose jobs. Right. So that we really have to dig down to the details to answer specific questions, but that's just the general framework I wanted to set up. And now we have like 10 minutes, 12 minutes left or so for questions. So I guess if you have questions for me, for Lisa, if Lisa has questions for me, do we want to go to the chat?
Can we start with questions from chat, from the students?
Yeah, I think, sure.
All right. I'm just gonna highlight one that was from maybe 20 minutes ago, from Alexander Glick, noting quote, and if AI were to put people out of work, somebody has to buy the goods. There would probably be a huge disinflationary effect where everything costs a fraction of what it does today. Alexander, did I get that right? Okay.
Yes, we said that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's definitely, I mean, Lisa maybe can speak to this more than I can, but definitely in a lot of the literature, that is some of the dystopian literature that you have, you definitely have people who worry about that, right? Which is, we're going to think that we're making everything better by making everything cheaper, but you're going to put everyone, out of jobs. There'll be no one to buy things. And so there are always unintended consequences. And yeah, at some level, that has to be part of the discussion. But I think it's, some of these questions are hard to answer because, that reality is really the maximalist, prediction that AI is really going to change it so much that there'll be very few people working and no one to buy anything. And bring us back to like, I don't know, essentially a situation of like, serfs, right? That 99% of people are living on $1 a day or whatever, and a few people are billionaires, which it could be. But again, whether that's likely, maybe Lisa can speak to more whether that's really going to, it's likely that AI will change it so completely that, everyone else will be poor and not be able to buy things. I think that's an overreach, though. Again, I can't deny there are dystopian writers who really think that's what's going to happen. But
well, yes and no. I think what this comes down to is sort of, and I'm curious to hear sort of what scripture has to say about redistribution, but it can, you can imagine scenarios in which probably not at scale, but what you're describing is happening. Even think of the example of the auditors. So say, or the tax software. I think that's sort of a nice little example where you can sort of play that through in your mind. Say, there's a tax software that sort of fully answers all of your questions, and at a click of a button, it does all your taxes for you, putting basically all tax consultants and auditors sort of out of work. Presumably that one tax software is sort of owned by one corporation, and then basically all the benefits go into one place, as opposed to many local tax consultants. Basically what I've just described is very much sort of the the case of an Amazon, right, where Amazon is sort of making people's lives easier, decreasing prices, but by and large is putting a lot of local businesses surely out of work. But then the question, I think, does become like, how do we tax the Amazon and that software, right? And if I think there are different scenarios in which there are just chances to then have a social structure in which more and more livelihood does depend on redistribution. On the other hand, if you put too high a tax burden on the Amazon, are they going to sort of get there in the first place? And I think that's very much in my mind this Europe versus US debate, right? Where how much do you tax the entrepreneurs and sort of the incentive to create an Amazon versus giving back to the people that you are you're potentially harming. But more to the point of artificial intelligence, like I say, I'm firmly in the camp that it is a lot more labor augmenting and also creating a lot more jobs. I realized that in my talk, I didn't even touch on all sort of the places where AI is sort of creating completely new jobs, right? That's also something to consider, that you have prompt engineers, or just so many different jobs that didn't even exist before AI.
All right.
And I'll just say that some of those questions, the other, like, my point today was that it's the right place to talk about this is not really the competition laws, but it is where, Lisa raised it, where tomorrow we'll talk about other values, like that come out of, maybe discussions around, charity broadly understood. which has a very different valence in halacha, where we really do deal more with the responsibilities of employers and society for people's general well-being, right? And that's really tomorrow's topic, because I think that really, the competition laws are the wrong place to look, even though they're the most intuitive. I think that the broader values around what maybe in broader culture would be called equity and redistribution, and halacha might come from staka and the like, is maybe a better place to discuss. But again, that's what we're going to see tomorrow.
All right. If we have time for another question, I'd like to open things up to the students. If anyone has a question, please feel welcome to speak out. Use the raise hand function. Share your thoughts. And if they're all right, Rabbi Kelson, was that
I'll jump in. Maybe we have another question, but thank you all so much. I'm sorry, my video has to be off just for the moment, but thank you so much. Maybe we have a few more minutes. Maybe our presenters have a question or reaction to each other's presentations. I'll open it up there.
Sure, and Lisa, I'll give you first crack at it if you
I mean, so many questions. I thought that was extremely interesting. Yeah, my mind did sort of go into the the competition and the redistribution piece. I don't have sort of a very precise question formulated in my mind right now, but I think you've given us so much very, very interesting things to think about.
What Lisa mentioned, that she didn't get too much into it, but she mentioned it both now and in her it's in the last pages of her presentation, that I think the sensibilities in terms of what this means for society, what we're going to see tomorrow is that, like, the moral voices that emerge out of the halachic discussion, this isn't just theoretical. Like, it really plays out in the different ways that, let's say, America and Europe conceive of the responsibilities of society to deal with these. And even with Europe, it's obviously much more complicated. Certain, different countries have different models. But it does strike me that it's not just difference in in economic models. It's has been highlighted by some economists, by many economists. It's really a difference in sort of a moral vision of the world. And part of that is how much your primary responsibility is to people who are employed rather than to consumers. How much it is to giving everyone how much it's to equity versus freedom of opportunity, come what may. And I think the fact that it's reflected in legislation differently highlights just how much this is a values question. It goes back to what I said at the beginning, that I think the reason it's important to grapple with these issues is because there are real moral issues at stake. And if you believe that the Torah has something to say about ethical issues, the fact that this is really, really a heated debate of how do we deal with these issues in legislation, any ethical system, and including Torah, should have something to say. And that's really why I think it's important to even ask these questions. It's not just theoretical, right? These are actually the conversations, and having religion be able to inform the conversations we have, so we have them better and more ethically, I think is important. That's
right. I agree, of course. And I want to thank you both for advancing our learning in that direction. Thank you both for being with us, Dr. Lisa Simon, Rabbi Jonathan Ziring. I encourage everyone, thank everyone else for being with us in our learning here. I'd encourage everyone to join us for the following two sessions, tomorrow morning and Tuesday morning, for the continuation of this series. And I would also encourage people to join the afternoon sessions tomorrow, Monday and Tuesday, with Rabbi David Silber, who I see is with us today, who will be taking sort of a step back and reflecting more broadly on the valence, not the definition, then valence and core narratives and teachings in the Torah regarding work and labor from the books of Genesis and Exodus and beyond. Those are at 12:30 p.m. Eastern tomorrow and Tuesday. All the information has been sent via our mailings. I hope everyone has that and hope to see you there. Thank you very much again for being with us, and to be continued. Have a good rest of the day.